Hello, welcome again to the Outside Fence for episode 5. I'm your host, Tristan Heffernan. With me once again is Stewart Brown. Bowles, how was your weekend?
It wasn't too bad. Punting-wise, took a small loss at Flemington, but it was looking a bit more dire early in the day, but managed to claw some back later in the day, which is good.
Beautiful. Footy, will we touch on at all, or we move straight on?
As an Essendon supporter, we'll leave that alone, I think.
Oh, beauty. Yours sounded a bit more leisurely than mine. I was tearing around up in Launceston with the kids, and that made punting a hell of a lot harder. But anyway, we'll get straight into the action here from Flemington. This is our third show looking back at Flemington, and we've chimed in every couple of weeks and starting to see a few of the form lines play out, which is interesting. How did you see the track there on Saturday?
Yeah, well, the track played very fair as far as I was concerned. It was a soft 5 going into the meeting with sort of no rain in the days leading up, so it sort of had plenty of time to sort of dry out, but it wasn't sort of the greatest drying conditions as come to expect this time of the year. But going into the meeting, the biggest variable, I suppose, with the weather was the wind. There was a strong northerly wind forecast, which is a headwind into the horse's face as they're coming around that sort of sweeping home turn. So I suppose with that headwind, ideally horses would want to have cover at that stage of the race and then sort of peel out towards the middle of the track, particularly in races that are run at sort of genuine tempos.
Yeah, we've talked before about the wind, and it's almost the unsolved variable in terms of everything. I don't even know if you can solve the wind, because it's not just the form, it's how people react. But we'll touch on that as we go through the program. We're going to start with race 3, which was the Byerley handicap, 1800 metres for 2-year-olds. And if you haven't watched episode 3, we reviewed I forget what it's called, it was the Taj Rossi or something. It used to be the old Gibson Carmichael, but we went back and looked at Cherry Tortoni beating Alycone and Johnny Get Angry. If you haven't watched that, it's definitely worth going back and having a quick look at the info we could get out of that race before we headed into this one. I might throw it over to you now, Balls, as we go to the replay. Tough win by the favourite Alycone, and there's a lot of spruik about him for Victoria Derby, which we might touch on a bit later as well.
Yep, yeah, there sure is. He went into this race as pretty much an even money favourite. He was very short throughout betting, and for good reason, I suppose. He's there in the all blue colours, the Godolphin blue, sort of pretty much up near the front there. Johnny Get Angry is the other horse of interest. He's third last in the red cap. And then the other horse that you'd probably want to keep an eye on is the grey that's currently second last on the inside there, Shadow Prey, who does run well. But as you can see, they pick up the race here, and Alycone finds a lovely spot, pretty much one out, one back there, just on the outside. So he's getting cover from any wind. Now, this race, they've gone at a very slow tempo, so as far as the wind wasn't, I suppose, too much of an issue for any of the horses. And as you'll note, the 2 lead-up races that Alycone ran behind Cherry Tortoni were also run at slow tempos into this. So this sort of speed was fairly common for these horses, and they'll tend to be used to it. But as they come past the 800 or so and up towards the home turn, Alycone settled well. It's in a very striking position. And jockey John Allen's pretty much just got the decision now to sort of ease out and let the horse stride into the race. And Johnny Get Angry is sort of that next pair back under a bit of riding on the inside. So if you're on Alycone at this stage, you're looking pretty happy with things. There hasn't been any issue in the race. He's pulled out at the right time and looks to be cruising up to the leaders. You will notice here as they get towards the 200, Johnny Get Angry makes a little bit of a run at the horse, and maybe for a moment you might have thought there's some worry, but as they get to sort of the last 100 Matt, you can tell that Alcyone's holding these horses, and it's a fairly comfortable win in the finish. There was nothing sort of outstanding in the time or the figures or late sectionals or anything like that. It was more a workmanlike win, but off a slow tempo, it was sort of hard for them to sort of really rate through the roof or do anything too special. But he's now a winner, Alycone, and off that run, you'd suggest that he can get further as well. And as you mentioned, there's a bit of Derby talk with him, and so I'd imagine that's a natural progression for him. He'd have a short break now, and come back and get prepared for the Derby in sort of early November.
We saw how he fought on in similar circumstances behind Cherry Tortoni, even though he's defeated then. And you do wonder if he maybe waits once he hits to the front at the moment. Alycone, still 2-year-old with a lot to learn. Much more to add on. Johnny Get Angry looked another really honest run.
Yeah, not a huge amount to add. He had every chance, sort of tracked through the winner pretty much, and sort of ran it fairly close margin in the end. But he's another that can head towards the Derby. But barring sort of improvement coming from 2 to 3 in the few months between now and then, it's hard to see him beating Alycone given even luck for both horses. But he looks a nice horse and he's worthy of aiming towards the Derby. Mm-hmm. The other horse I did mention was Shadow Prey, the grey, who came down the outside there. He's run the fastest last 400 and 200 of the race. So it shows he was strong at the finish, and that slow tempo probably didn't suit him from how far back he settled. So he's another horse that I suppose would head towards that Derby, but would obviously need to improve as well.
Yeah, just the second start there for Shadow Prey. I think that he's definitely got a bit of catching up to do on the others, so that was a really good effort. I want to talk a little bit about derbies because there's a huge spruik obviously at the moment on Alycone heading towards a Derby and Cherry Tortoni, but is that just because they're the ones we've got to talk about at the moment? I've gone back through the past Derby winners. I'm a little concerned about the preparations they've got to get to the Derby because I've gone back through some winners. Had Warning, raced in May, had a break, resumed in September. Extra Brute debuted in August and raced through. Ace High resumed in July and raced through. Prized Icon resumed in August after a classic 2-year-old prep, so to speak. Tarzino, he was more your staying type. He debuted in July, had a little let up and then raced through from August. And Polanski, who was obviously a real dyed-in-the-wool star, he raced in May and then resumed in September. So all those horses were at much shorter trips if they were even up and going by this time of year. Do you think that, given these horses have been through 1,1800 metres, if they give them a month off now, I don't know, it just feels to me like they're going to be up for a long time to get through to a Derby?
It is definitely something to think about and can be a concern, especially considering all these horses are pretty much in their first racing preparation as well. So if they don't have that long a break, it can be quite a long prep to have for your first prep. And that can sort of come into it. It's obviously something definitely to keep an eye on as they get through a few runs when they do come back. It's not obviously the end of the world, and James Cummings training LC1, I wouldn't be one to sort of second guess whether he knows what he's doing. And plus these horses can come back with a bit of residual fitness as well, so maybe they can sort of kick off again, have that little bit longer break, but then kick off again at, say, 1,600 or something like that on their way to a Derby. But, we'll have to wait and see when they do come back what sort of preparations are in store for them.
Yep, fair call. I guess we'll know more once they do come back. For me, I'm totally against these horses if you're looking at futures for the Derby. I'm not saying they can't win, but taking $10 Alycone, I think you want to be on some pretty good stuff. Let's move on now to race 6, which was won by a horse called Right You Are, the TAB ATA Trainers Trust race. Now, maybe Balls, this was one of the more interesting races of the day. Maybe you could just touch on what was so interesting about it, and then we'll go to the replay.
Yeah, well, going into the meeting, this was the race, I suppose I was, from a viewing point of view, I was looking forward to most for the day. It was for the 3-year-olds, and there were a fair few promising types in it. Some of them had come through that Flemington race a couple of weeks ago. That was run over a mile, and so they sort of met again here. Plus, there was a little bit of fresh blood thrown in there that sort of had shown a bit racing in the country and provincial areas. So it was good to see them sort of all meet, and then you could sort of get a gauge of where they're all at.
Okay, cool. We'll go to the replay and we'll get you to talk us through it once again.
Yep, so as you see, it's a big field here, but they've only gone at a slow tempo once again. So you can see it gets quite messy here early up the front. Like there's a lot of horses sort of wanting that position, sort of 4th, 5th, 6th, just behind the leaders, but obviously you can't fit them all in there. So a horse in particular in the yellow and black stripes is about midfield now on the inside, getting eased back. called Over the Sky. It was not a beneficiary of that sort of shuffling up at the start. It had barrier 2 and they wanted to start. They wanted to settle a lot closer. However, as you can see, it got shuffled sort of right back. And going into the race, I thought barrier 2 was going to be its biggest issue. But the horses you want to look out for here, the eventual winner's Right You Are, which is in about 6th spot now in the yellow colours with the red cap. And then the other 2 place scares are Stretto, which is 3 back the fence in the brown cap, and then Kurame, who is behind it in the green and yellow. We also want to keep an eye on Over the Sky, who is finally getting to the outside here, but he spent a lot of the race trying to get to the outside. Now, as they come into the straight here, you'll see most of the action as far as the place getters goes over towards the inside there. Horses such as Stretto, Kurame, and Right You Are all taking tight runs to get through and challenge for the front there. As you can see, Over the Sky's down the outside and he's just fading on his run a little bit. But as you can see, Right You Are gets fully through now and nabs Stretto right on the line. Now, it doesn't look, I suppose, anything outstanding to win. It's a bit of a bunch finish, but you can get that off a slow tempo. But I think this horse is quite progressive. It's still not the fully furnished product, I don't think. It did carry a big weight there on Saturday, and it was dropping back from 2,000 metres and a month between runs too. So it's the sort of horse I wouldn't be shocked if it can get to lower level stakes grade. Maybe in the spring, maybe that might be too soon for it. Maybe it might be the autumn, it's time. But it's definitely a horse that's got a bit of progression to it, and he's worth following.
Yeah, okay. Let's. Well, I think the place getters were pretty self-explanatory. They had pretty good runs and ran on well, pretty much getting every chance. Let's look outside there maybe for another run. Maybe look at more at Over the Sky, who you pointed out there, and he had a really different run to the horses that filled the place getters. Can we take more on him?
I think you can. He's quite a promising horse. He was unlucky in that 1,600 metre race I mentioned at Flemington a couple of weeks ago. And once again on Saturday, he didn't have huge luck. As I mentioned, he drew gate 2. That wasn't ideal. He got shuffled back at the start and then really had to work hard to get towards the outside. Now, and it was a slow tempo as well. He has run the third fastest, a split between the 600 and 400, and the second fastest 4 to the 2 of the race, and then died on his run a bit, only running the 11th fastest last 200. Now, many might look at that and say, oh, look, hasn't he run a mile? He's faded on his run, but he was quite strong through the line to start before. I just think that early buffeting, the work to get to the outside, the slow tempo, and then working to get into the race with those good sectionals between the 6 and the 2 are sort of told on the horse late. Now, this horse is in its first preparation. That was its 4th run, so there's a high chance it probably goes for a break now too. But it's definitely a horse that I'd sort of just mark down to see how it comes back next preparation, as I think it's probably got more wins in store for it.
Okay, I sort of like that point. Sometimes you can miss a few of these things if you're just watching the last 800 metres of a race. Is how much some of that early work can really go against these horses, which might not be immediately apparent. Outside of those runners, anyone else we can maybe take away that might still be up and go on this prep?
Yeah, well, there's 2 horses that also ran the race that I thought were at least admirable performances. Mr. Cancun was one from Lindsay Smith's stable. Now, he was a dominant winner at Geelong at the start prior, and he's always shown plenty of promise. He sat outside the leader here, and hit the front sort of early in the straight, which I don't ideally think is his go. He might be better sort of a bit further back off them and sort of having that last shot at them. As I said, he hit the front quite early. He fought on okay, but sort of got run over by those other horses. And the other horse, I think I should mention, Smokin' Romans. Now, it's an interesting horse. It's Ma Eustace horse. Has had its first 2 starts on the Ballarat Synthetic and was quite dominant, winning both races. Now, this was its first run on turf, so it was always hard sort of going into the race to get a guide on sort of how you think it will perform. But it sat 3 wide without cover for the race, which obviously wasn't ideal on the day, and wasn't too far away at the finish. Having that run on grass now, you'd think he probably sort of comes on for the run. And as we know with the Ma Eustace stable, they tend to be able to get long preparations out of their horse. So, yeah, that's a horse I'd sort of be keeping an eye on, Smokin' Romans, in the next sort of few weeks. If it finds sort of a similar or even weaker race, it's got to be a good chance in it.
Okay, we'll note him down, Smoking Romans, and we'll have a look at the map next time for Mr. McKean Coon to see if he can be ridden a little more quietly. We're going to look at one more race on the program here. This is another one I'll give you a little spruik for, Balls. If you hadn't watched episode 2, you can go back and look at the run of this horse called Creedence. You read in the form guides, he was 6th of 11, beaten 3.4 lengths, but when we reviewed the race on that occasion, Balls gave this horse a really good push, Creedence, and he was really well found there on Saturday, which you might not have picked up on really if you were just looking at that number in the form guide. So do yourself a favour and get back and check that out. It was a bit of a different run from him though this time, Creedence, Balls. He was back there at Caulfield, but he was much closer to the speed here. Was there any reason for that?
There probably was. As you can see, the horse to look for here is in the purple and orange stripes, sort of pushing forward now. Didn't jump great, but you can see the intent from jockey Michael Poy to get the horse in a forward position. Now, in the morning of the race, there was an early scratching in Tabby Run, which was the designated leader in the race and generally likes to run along in front. But with him coming out, a lot of the speed came out of the race. So Michael Poy used his initiative and went forward. Now, he was drawn wide, so there was every chance he was going to get caught wide. He was sort of, if he got some luck, he might be able to slot in there. But as you can see, he's got caught 3 wide there. Now, a thing of note here is that the leader is Sully. It's ridden by Michael Walker. Now, Walker is notorious for going probably as slow as possible as he can on leaders. So, like I mentioned with Dwayne Dunn a few weeks ago, if you find a race where Walker's on the leader, generally, it's not sort of a hard and fast rule, but generally it will be a slow tempo race, as this was. Now, Creedence is sitting 3 deep, no cover there, which you might say is a disadvantage because of the wind on the day. But given the very slow tempo they've gone, it's not really that much of a disadvantage. He's sort of in a nice rhythm. He's not really working too hard into that wind. And he's just sort of cruising along at his own steam. Another horse to watch in the race is Vacillator, which is on the back of Creedence there in the red cap. And then the one of the early favourites in the race was Bartholomew Diaz, which is currently outside the leader in the blue colours, just about to go to the front now. But as you'll see early in the straight, he sort of wilts a bit, and Creedence takes over.
Okay, bit of the Lord Belvedere colours, are they there?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, same though.
So Vacillator, it seems to me he's had every possible chance to run Creedence down. I know the 3 deep, the trip might not have been such a disadvantage with the slow tempo, but it probably still wasn't ideal, was it?
No, yeah, in an ideal world you wouldn't want to be there, but Creedence is absolutely flying this prep, and he does have form over longer as well, so sort of having to, I suppose, in essence, work a little bit is probably not that big a deal for him, and plus he's probably suited being out in clear air, being able to wind up at his own speed rather than sort of having to duck and dive in between horses and take runs. The horse Vacillator that you mentioned there did have every chance sitting on the back of the winner. I don't think he's quite a 2,000 metre horse. Obviously, the slow speed would have helped him, and he did have absolutely every chance. So he continues to race well. So if he dropped back to a mile race in the coming weeks, then he's going to be a chance in that. And I mentioned Bartholomew Diaz, one of the early favourites, sat outside the leader there. They went into slow speed, and he didn't find a huge amount in the straight. Now, looking at the steward's report, he did pull up with blood in one nostril, which obviously indicates there's some kind of issue there. That won't count as a bleed and a 3-month ban, but it's probably somewhat of a forgive run for the horse because obviously all was not right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's pretty easy to forgive a horse when they come back with blood in the nose, I think. That's without being a vet by any stretch of the imagination. There's one more horse in that race I want to touch on because you did mention him or her, I'm not sure which it is, in the Winter Championship a fortnight ago. That was Polly Gray.
Yep.
Is this just a horse that's going to keep running on every week?
Well, yeah, it was another good run on Saturday. Obviously, the horse is from New Zealand. It's only had now 3 runs in Australia, so it's sustained to build a bit of a profile over here. It settled well back in the field and sort of got shuffled back a bit in the run, but has made good ground again, like it did in the Winter Championship, and was sort of the best last 200 of the race and 9th best of the meeting. Now, it's obviously got home very well off those figures, but that sort of shows how slowly they have gone. That in a 2,000 metre race, the horses run the ninth fastest last 200 of the day, and only been able to sort of get in just into the placings there.
Okay.
But it's a horse who's going well, and sort of a similar sort of race, even back to a mile. In the next few weeks would definitely be within its grasp.
Just wants a bit of pace on, you reckon, back to a mile?
Yep, and even a bit of juice in the track wouldn't hurt it either.
Okay, beauty. We'll pop him on the list as well. Thank you, Balls. That's our review of Flemington here. We're going to go to the viewer questions quickly. It'll be a quick one this week. We just got the one from Joe on Twitter. Would like to hear from you guys about any tipsters you rate in the media. Who is worth following if you don't have time to do the form yourself? Who would you take great note of if you heard a strong push from, Balls?
Yeah, well, obviously the other week we had a sort of question in a similar vein, I suppose, and we mentioned Dean Lester. He seems to be as good as anyone in Victoria. There's a few guys on racing.com that seem to go okay. Personally, I tend to like to do the form and sort of get my own thoughts before looking or seeing what other tipsters tip, just so you don't sort of get their thoughts in your head, I suppose, when you think. But yeah, guys like Dean Lester or even Ben Asghari on racing.com, I think David Gately on Sky Channel, those sort of guys seem to do as good a job as anyone in the media.
Yeah, they're pretty... I think what you say about doing your own form is good. Joe's obviously touching on if you don't have the time to do yourself, but even if you do your own form, sometimes those guys can raise areas that you might have overlooked yourself. So I think it's always worth listening to others without necessarily taking everything on board that they have to say. It's all right to disagree with them. That's for sure. I agree with you on Asghari. I find him quite good on racing.com. Obviously, I don't take as much of a notice of the mainland as you do, Balls, but Ben Asghari and Matt Welsh, if I see one of them tip up one at longer odds and you give it a chance too, that's usually enough of a push for me to have something on. Thank you once again, Joe, for your questions. We're going to go now to the takeaway of the week. Balls, I might let you kick things off here. I have a little feeling I know what you're going to bring up here.
Yep, so as mentioned earlier, there was those windy conditions at Flemington on Saturday, particularly that strong northerly wind, which was a headwind for the horses around the sort of home turn. Now, when there are windy conditions, and particularly a headwind, it's highly likely that race speeds are going to be run at a slower tempo than you would generally expect. It's obviously not an exact science, but it's something you definitely need to keep in mind when you're looking at the form and I suppose building a bit of a speed profile for the race, that the weather conditions, sort of what bearing they're going to play on that. The reason for the sort of slower conditions, I suppose, is most riders will want cover from that wind, which means horses are less likely to really want to lead and run along. So if more horses are wanting cover, then there's sort of more negative rides and it can become quite messy racing. Now, as I mentioned, we saw Creedence sit wide with no cover into the headwind and win on the weekend. Obviously, you can give the horse a big tick for that, but also it shows that it is possible if they go at a slow speed. El Questro was another winner. They went at a very slow speed in the race it won, and it led and sort of never gave them a look in. So it's not impossible to lead and win into the wind, but it's sort of something you need to keep an eye on as far as tempo of races.
Yeah, very good point. Wind is... I continue to mention it's really hard for me to try and predict. And like you say, you've got to also predict what the jockeys are going to do, which can be very hard at times. Now, in your punting, Balls, would you sort of start to shy away from the shorter price runners maybe because you don't have great faith in the tempo, or maybe horses that don't map particularly well, do you give them a little bit of leeway, I guess?
I'm definitely more cautious when I'm betting when there is sort of wind around that I know will have effect on the way the races are run. So, it's one of the first things I actually check before doing the form for a meeting. Obviously, what the weather's going to be like. You want to see if there's going to be any rain about or anything like that, but also definitely check for the wind as well. And yeah, so if there is, I've always got that in the back of my mind, and knowing sort of the ins and outs of a lot of jockeys and how they ride, and particularly the ins and outs of horses' racing styles, you sort of need to compute all that together and then sort of help that, and use that to help you get find the winner.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. My takeaway this week is to do with jockeys. I'm less of a jockey basher than I used to be, but I'm still very, very hard on how I mark jockeys and which jockeys I want to back and which ones I don't. One thing it's been reinforced in the last few weeks betting on Tassie with our different track biases and how our tracks have been playing down here is fair enough. Jockeys are obviously better than others. Some are better than others, but you've got to try not to get lazy in just assessing them. This is a good jockey, this is a bad jockey, because they can perform very differently under different circumstances. Now, obviously, we think about horses, riders who perform better on a certain style of horse. We know there's a lot of riders who can ride well on a front runner but get them back in the field and they might struggle, and the reverse is true. Balls, you've mentioned Dwayne Dunn and Michael Walker. I think they're two jockeys that we'd prefer to back from off the speed rather than setting the tempo. Now, one area that isn't talked about as much is when there is track bias, I think. This is something that's caught me out in recent weeks. Jockeys you may like to risk on tracks that are racing really truly and horses are on the rails. They're not necessarily as big a risk when the fields are spreading out and racing wide is no disadvantage. That's definitely caught me out a couple of times lately. So on those tracks where horses are getting wide and there's a bit more space in the field and making your run on the inside isn't as important. Just be a little bit wary when you're marking your jockeys heavily. That's my takeaway this week. Racing's slowly heating up more and more each week now, Balls. We've got Bletchley Stakes coming up on Caulfield. What can we expect from this meeting?
Bletchley Stakes Day this week, which will feature a lot of horses that raced at the Caulfield meeting from 2 weeks ago, I suppose, the day that Jungle Edge won the Monash. Now, that was run on a heavy track, and I've just had a quick peep at the weather forecast for Melbourne this week, and it seems sort of minimal rain, so I'd expect a better track. It'll still probably be soft, but not sort of deep into the soft range. So there might be a few form turnarounds out of that meeting from 2 weeks ago. Obviously, being on a heavy track suited the wet trackers and wouldn't have suited a few horses that don't like that those sort of heavy conditions. So just be a bit cautious when doing the form for this Caulfield meeting, as there could be some turnarounds. And obviously, you probably want your horses who like it just a bit on the dry side than heavy.
Okay, excellent. Make sure you go back and check out episode 4 where we looked at the Monash there, and that'll get you all ready for Bletchley Stakes Day. Thanks again to you, Balls. Thanks to everyone who watched and sent in questions. Thanks to the sponsors, teachmehorsracing.com. If you want to improve your punting, get along there and have a look there. And we will see you next week. Thank you, Balls. Have a good week.
Thanks, F. You too.